Is a greater Israel emerging? From its settlements in the West Bank to its ongoing war in Gaza and its military operations in Lebanon and Syria, critics argue that Israel's actions suggest ambitions to create a state that extends far beyond its internationally recognised borders. However, others insist that this isn't the case. Israel's policies are merely a response to the country's complex security threats. So, what exactly does Greater Israel mean, and how should we really understand current developments? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. Throughout history, territorial expansion has been a central theme of international relations and conflict. While this has often focused on access to resources, it may also be centred on efforts to reclaim territories lost through conflict or acquire land historically seen as part of the nation. However, in the modern era, few countries act on these ambitions. While such ideas may be widely held in private or expressed by extremists, they typically remain outside the bounds of official policy. Nevertheless, just occasionally, a policy of territorial expansion appears to enter the political mainstream. An interesting case in point is Israel. While the concept of Greater Israel, also known as Eretz Israel, has long been a central theme for the country, there's a growing sense that the idea has become official policy, sparking intense debates about Israel's actions in the West Bank, Gaza, and beyond. Although the idea of a Greater Israel is rooted in ancient history and biblical Israel, our story really begins in 19th century Europe. Against the backdrop of widespread persecution and building on ideas of nationalism, European Jews began outlining plans for a Jewish homeland. Known as Zionism, the movement drew on several biblical passages to define the boundaries of this new state. While some have argued that the ambition was to create an Israel that went all the way from the Nile in Egypt through to the Euphrates in modern-day Iraq, in reality, the initial focus was instead on Palestine, which was then under Ottoman rule. However, the critical moment came during the First World War when Britain seized Palestine. Keen to win the support of the Jewish population, in November 1917, the British government stated its support for creating a Jewish national homeland. This was cemented in 1922 when the League of Nations accepted British control of Palestine and recognised the aim of reconstituting a Jewish national home, albeit without prejudicing the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. As hundreds of thousands of Jews arrived in Palestine in the 1930s to escape the persecution in Europe, tensions rapidly escalated with the Arab population. But while Britain began exploring options to partition Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, these ideas were abandoned at the start of the Second World War. Keen to keep the Arab population on its side, the UK instead proposed a joint Arab and Jewish state and restricted further Jewish immigration into the territory. Angered by this, several Jewish groups launched an armed insurgency. As a result, in January 1947, Britain handed the matter over to the United Nations, which eventually proposed partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state composed of 56% of the territory and an Arab state making up the remaining 44%. Meanwhile, Jerusalem would become an international city. Following a UN General Assembly resolution that endorsed the plan, Britain announced that it would withdraw from Palestine on the 14th of May 1948. In the months that followed, the situation rapidly deteriorated as fighting broke out between Jews and Arabs. Meanwhile, just hours after it became independent, Israel was attacked by its Arab neighbours. However, Israeli forces managed to push them back, and by the time the fighting ended in March 1949, Israel controlled 78% of Palestine. At the same time, the remaining areas, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza, came under Jordanian and Egyptian control. From the start, there was considerable debate in Israel about the new country's future borders. While some Israelis wanted to pursue a policy of further expansion to absorb East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and even Jordan, many of the country's leaders, including David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, wanted to focus on consolidating the new state. Despite this, another conflict erupted in 1956. Following Egyptian efforts to block shipping to Israel, Israeli forces invaded Egypt as part of a British and French plan to seize the Suez Canal. However, under US pressure, they were soon forced to withdraw. In the end, the real turning point came in 1967 with the Six-Day War. Against a build-up of Arab forces on its borders, Israel launched a surprise attack. As well as seizing control of Gaza, East Jerusalem and the West Bank, it took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria. While the UN Security Council called on Israel to end its occupation of the territories, the conflict sparked a broader political debate within Israel. Although many on the political right saw the new territories as Israel's historic heritage that must be retained, the left instead tended to see them as bargaining chips for peace with its Arab neighbours. In October 1973, yet another war broke out as Egypt and Syria attacked Israel in an attempt to win back the Sinai and the Golan Heights. But while the attacks ultimately failed and Israel remained in control of the areas, it nevertheless provoked a new debate about the need for a lasting peace. The first elements of this came to fruition when Israel signed a US-brokered agreement with Egypt that saw Israel withdraw from the Sinai in 1982. But while Israel's right-wing Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his agreement with Egypt, he steadily cemented Israel's control over the other areas that it had seized in 1967. Faced with ongoing Syrian opposition to Israel's existence, he announced the annexation of the strategically vital Golan Heights in 1981, a move condemned by the UN Security Council. At the same time, Israel also began a policy of expanding settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. To add to this, following growing attacks by Palestinian militants, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. By the start of the 1990s, the situation was changing. Despite expanding settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, a Palestinian uprising was becoming a significant challenge for Israel. As a result, a historic peace deal was brokered in 1993. In return for a Palestinian recognition of Israel's right to exist, Israel would eventually withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and allow the creation of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders. But while much of mainstream Israeli society saw this as a pragmatic step towards peace, especially as the agreement also saw a peace deal between Israel and neighbouring Jordan, many on the nationalist right saw it as an unacceptable betrayal. This in turn led to the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995. I hope you're finding this helpful. If so, please do consider giving the video a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. In the years that followed, the situation continued to evolve. While Israel eventually withdrew its forces from southern Lebanon in 2000, any hopes for progress towards the final establishment of a Palestinian state began to falter. As another Palestinian uprising began, Israel strengthened its military presence on the ground and increased its settlement activity. Controversially, it also constructed a so-called security wall beyond the 1967 borders, a move eventually declared illegal by the International Court of Justice. And yet, while Israel steadily consolidated its control over the West Bank, an area known to Israelis as Judea and Samaria, in 2005 it dismantled its settlements in Gaza and withdrew its forces. Following this, the situation appeared relatively static. Although Israel launched another invasion of southern Lebanon in 2006 to take on Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shia group, this was short-lived and Israeli forces soon withdrew again. On the other hand, under right-wing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been in control almost continually since 2009, Israel has steadily increased its control over the West Bank. But of course, the crucial turning point came on the 7th of October 2023 when Hamas attacked Israel from Gaza, leading to a full-scale Israeli invasion of the territory. Since then, Israel has steadily expanded its military operations elsewhere. As well as taking on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon in late 2024, following the fall of Assad, it's moved its forces beyond the Golan Heights and deeper into Syria. All this has now prompted some to argue that Israel is clearly pursuing an expansionist agenda. But is this really the case? On the one hand, the Netanyahu government argues that any such claims are unfounded. The focus is on security, not expansion. The conflicts since October 2023 have been focused on defending Israel from Hamas and Hezbollah, and more recently to counteract any instability in Syria. It also argues that there's no recent history of threats towards the broader Arab world. Indeed, Israel has extended its ties with various Arab states in recent years. None of this would be sustainable if there were in fact a policy of territorial conquest. Moreover, there's been no formal annexation process apart from the Golan Heights. Finally, many observers have pointed out that Netanyahu's actions aren't driven by an ideology of territorial expansion, but are instead focused on his internal domestic political problems. The conflicts are effectively an attempt to save his political position. In contrast, critics insist that something deeper is at play. While there may be no formal talk of annexation now, it's been frequently heard in the past. More to the point, under the Netanyahu administration, there's been a massive expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Even if annexation hasn't been announced, the International Court of Justice ruled in 2024 that it is, in fact, happening. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's reliance on far-right and hardline religious Zionist parties, many of which advocate for Israeli control of all the lands of biblical Israel, needs to be considered. Even if he isn't personally committed to an expansive Greater Israel, his government is aligned with those that are. Indeed, the country's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, has not only openly called for the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, but openly talked about extending Israeli control as far as Damascus. So, is a Greater Israel really emerging? Ultimately, it depends on what one means by this term. If one takes the most expansive view and thinks of it in biblical terms, then the answer is clearly no. Notwithstanding the positions of various extremists, Israel simply isn't pursuing a policy of expansion to the Nile and Euphrates. Any past ambitions that even came close to this have been put to one side with peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. Indeed, it seems wholly unrealistic that these will be broken. However, if one takes the view, as many do, that Greater Israel instead constitutes the broader territory of Palestine, most specifically the West Bank, then the answer is undoubtedly yes. All the evidence suggests that the current Israeli administration has absolutely no intention of honouring a two-state solution and has embarked on a process of wholesale annexation. But between these two positions, there are now growing questions about what's going to happen to the other territories under Israeli control. What does it propose to do with Gaza? What will happen to the Golan Heights? And could it yet stay in place in southern Lebanon? So while it's clear that some form of Greater Israel is now being pursued, it's still entirely unclear precisely what this means. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.